Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want?
Okay. Yeah. Hi, I'm Jeanne Vaccaro.
I'm Jennifer Doyle.
And we're the co-curators of Scientia Sexualis, and this is the last weekend of the exhibition, so we're so grateful to see old friends, new friends, and take you all through the exhibition today, and really grateful to have many of the artists in the show here with us today and contributors to the catalog as well.
So we're going to dive right in, and I just want to give you a heads up that this is going to take about an hour, a little under, and we're going to turn to a couple people who are here to share their insights about some work in the show. And with that, I guess I'll start with some explanation of our title. Yeah?
Yeah. And okay. You all probably know that this exhibition is part of the Getty Pacific Standard Time Art and Science Collide initiative. And our interpretation of art and science was, how about actually sex and science?
Yeah. So the title of our show, Scientia Sexualis, is lifted from Michel Foucault's Introduction to the History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And this is a major text in sexuality studies, foundation text. It's the kind of work that when you read it for the first time, you start to understand that sexuality has a history. It's strange how deeply controversial that statement has become just in the past few months, the increasing intensity of that. He uses this term in a section. He has a section that's actually called Scientia Sexualis, and it describes a near explosion in the 19th century of scientific discourse, scientific interest in the sexual body. He contrasts that with ars erotica. And this is the most fun thing to teach, is just to think about the different kinds of knowledge practices that are represented by a field like sexology or psychiatry versus the kind of sexual knowledge that one might encounter in the Kama Sutra, right? Or in pedagogically oriented pornography, which is teaching us how to have more pleasure, better sex, more and better sex.
So our exhibition is really interested in the scientific discourses like sexology, anthropology, psychiatry that have governed the sexual, racial, gendered body, and kind of thinking about moments of both violence and pleasure, the clinical and the erotic kind of coming together. And we want to just stop for a moment and talk about not only the title of the exhibition, but the kind of choices that we made around the aesthetics of the show in terms of the typography and the font. So you can read more about this in our catalog, which I highly recommend. This font actually was kind of reconstructed by B. Oakley, who is the publisher and designer who's represented here in the bookshelf residency. Their project is called Gender Fail. And B actually worked with the protest banners that were made by STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which was a mutual aid project that was started by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. Many people know their names, but don't know about the kind of abolitionist mutual aid work that they did. And so B. Oakley kind of reconstructed the alphabet using whatever letters they were able to reconstruct from archival images of protest banners. And we wanted to bring that kind of bodily, disruptive, protest-oriented space of organizing and activism and mutual aid into a project that so much is about the kind of oppressive constraints of science on the body, to also have spaces of freedom, engaging and aerating that constraint.
There's a tension throughout the show between different kinds of aesthetic registers, which this font speaks to. There's a version of a show like this that could have had a hyper-clinical, cold, hygienic feel, and while you will encounter that kind of cool, kind of clinical presence, we want people to feel the slick, the wet, the fluid, and the fleshy. Yeah.
Yeah. So come on into the show.
Come in and surround this. Yeah. We're going to talk about Sandra Ibarra's chest rest, and it wants you to get close and to look and study it.
So this, like Jennifer said, is one of the works that kind of evokes the cold and the clinical. This is a kind of deconstructed and remade wheelchair that was made through the kind of an archival interpretation of Bob Flanagan and Cherie Rose's practice. And their archives held at the One Archives was the basis of an entire exhibition that Sandra did around this series.
Yeah, great.
And we want to...
Yeah, I'm happy to introduce myself. So my name is Ashton Phillips. I'm an artist and a writer and also a scholar that writes specifically about art, aesthetics, and transness from my own practice, but also engaging with other artists. And so I was able to be engaged with this show actually through the run of it. I was here at the opening in October. I brought my class at Otis here for a visit the week of the election. And now I'm here with you today. And so part of me engaging with this work, writing about it for Carla, and also writing a longer form essay about this show for Trans Studies Quarterly has been about engaging with how this work has changed and the world that it is living within. And I would say that the thing that sticks out for me the most about this work right now is a lesson about pleasure and survival. So I was actually able to see this work at Human Resources a few years ago when it was up as part of a solo show there. The thing that stuck with me the most from being in the artist walkthrough there was a statement that Bob Flanagan apparently made that Sandra Ibarra relayed to us, which was that Bob Flanagan was a kind of professional, if you will, not maybe professional, but a submissive. And he was also lived his life with cystic fibrosis, which at the time was a terminal condition where there was a life expectancy that most people that were living with cystic fibrosis would not expect to live past their early 30s. And Bob lived into his 40s, and apparently he credited his kink practice with his dom, Cherie Rose, for his survival, for his longevity, and in particular his ability to subvert the pain of his experience of his body into pleasure. And so this work makes some of that, I think, available to us. It confronts us with the specificity of these piercings, with flesh, with the kind of clinical aesthetics. And I think that not just in this work, but I think in a lot of the work in the show, there is this tension between pleasure and pain, between the power of being a body that is subject to a medical gaze, the vulnerability of being a body that needs medical care, whether you're a trans person that needs to access gender-affirming care, or whether you are a person living with a disability like Bob Flanagan that needed access to medical care to survive. These themes recur throughout, and there is a lesson that feels as radical today as it was then, more radical now, than at the beginning of the show, very urgent, that we have the power within ourselves, within our relationships, with each other, to our body, and to pleasure, to subvert the pain of our experience into a kind of connection with each other and to survive. So anyway, I could talk about all of the work forever, but that feels like the most important thing about this work for me right now, relating with you. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you. Really appreciate Ashton, because one of the pleasures of having a show up this long is we've had a chance to be in ongoing conversation with people who've been spending time with the show over months. And I want to encourage people to, as you're moving around, to get close and just to appreciate that these are made after Cherie's photographs of Bob Flanagan's body. So we're looking at homages to not just Bob Flanagan's flesh, but Cherie Rose's work on Bob's flesh. And in this instance, you have the artist Sandra Ibarra kind of taking the position of Cherie in doing the piercing, and there's a scarring on the surface of this pad. So with that, I think maybe I'll turn to Jeanne.
Yeah, I'll say something about Nicki Green's work, because Nicki will be on a panel tomorrow with Oliver Husain and Kerstin Schroedinger, who are also here. This work is thinking about the mikveh, which is a Jewish cleansing ritual that one enters after menstruation and before you can re-enter the marriage bed. So it's a very sort of heterosexual, cisgender, binary proposition in some ways. And Nicki is interested in thinking about how one might queer and trans those rituals for her own experiences of self-actualization, care, healing, and kind of thinking about ritual and routine together. There's also this kind of nod to a urinal. The space of the bathroom is a gay cruising site, and you can come up and touch the water. It's really fun. And tomorrow we'll be on there'll be a panel with Nicki and Oliver and Kerstin thinking about practices of mutual aid and radical care in medicine.
So this is a self-portrait of the artist on the analyst's couch. This comes out of a dream that Eisenman had, in which Eisenman was um, like desperate, unhoused, clothes falling apart, dirty feet, in absolute need. And in this dream, an anxiety dream, the artists would find themselves in their father's, basically on their father's couch, right, under the treatment of their father. And this invites a kind of Freudian reading, right? So there's the kind of Freudian joke, the symbologies that we use to interpret dreams and the like. And it's very playful in that sense. And one need only point to the wilting daisy and the white phallus, the cold and empty hearth, and I could go on. There's lots of Easter eggs. It kind of wants you to kind of play with it in that way, but you're going to bounce around almost like the surface of a pinball machine. My students, when we talked about this in the fall, they were very quick to get much deeper and to think about embarrassment, right, and shame and negative affects. That was actually where my students went very quickly. The library here is a phenomenal one. Students and readers of psychoanalytic theory will just see lots of gems here. There's, in addition to the works of Sigmund Freud here, we have the DSM-3, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and there's kind of a happy alignment between the placement of this painting, which is centered on this kind of therapeutic scene, and also family drama. It was in a walkthrough a couple weeks ago, somebody was observing that we can think about this painting too in terms of the roots of Freudian psychoanalysis in analytic work being done on family members, on children in particular, which is a kind of a incestuous archive that's embedded within psychoanalytic theory, and that's going on here too. So, but with the DSM-3 here, we can actually turn over to Joseph Liatella's on Being an Idea, the Right to Live Without Permission.
And we're so happy that Joseph has come all the way from New York for the weekend and will share a few words about this piece. Thank you, honey.
Well, thank you, Jeanne and Jennifer, for just having this work. It's such a privilege. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. To have the work being being engaged within such a thoughtful and just amazing way. So, but yeah, this is On Being an Idea, the Right to Live Without Permission. It consists of the DSM-4. And so this was the last DSM that included gender identity disorder in it. And now we have the DSM-5, which has been updated to include gender dysphoria disorder. And they're bound together using shibari rope ties, which I tied using like a shibari hemp rope, which is, a BDSM practice used to restrain and restrict the body. The weight of them is about the equivalent of the weight of a body, and it also has this underlying red light that's sort of referencing, like the leather bar or the nightclub, but also red being this color that's used in like emergency and hospitals as well. And so thinking about like how the arrangement of a trans body being constituted as a psychological disorder was something that was like pretty interesting to me. But also thinking about like the tension of relying on a system that is pretty inherently oppressive, right? When you think about the medical and legal, corporate flows of capital and medicine and how those are oppressive in many different ways on a national and international scale. But also needing those in order to survive, like relying on the systems in order to survive, to be embodied and to find pleasure and connection with both oneself and a history and one another. And so with that, I was sort of bringing in these themes of BDSM and nightlife and queer underground culture, and then also, of course, the DSM-4 as well. And also the plinth is sort of modeled after great classical sculpture. If you go to something like the Met, you'll see these like reclined figures on top of these plinths, and so it's also sort of having a nod to that as well. So thinking about like where these ideas come from, how they shape and impact the body, how they restrain, but also allow for a type of embodiment and existence as well. Great, I think that's everything.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph.
This work is in an alignment with two quite explicitly sexological works. One is Objects of Pleasure by Gala Porras Kim, a collaboration between Gala Porras Kim and Young Jun Kwak. This work was made in the depths of lockdown when we couldn't be in each other's company, and the two artists are close friends. They made this work in response to the invitation to imagine pleasure for each other. And if you visit a sexological museum like the Wellcome Collection in London, you will see displays that look very much like this. And your ability to read those displays may it'll be shaped by your familiarity with these kinds of objects and how one uses them. Jeanne?
All right. Anyone want to volunteer? So one of the other things that we loved about this work, which isn't only asking about the pleasure of another and how we kind of care for that, it also is a nod to a kind of cabinet of curiosity. And we were thinking about the museological and how things are put on display. There's a lot of little fun objects in here, from kind of medieval torture devices to the Sex and the City, made famous by Sex and the City rabbit, the Cadillac of vibrators, the magic wand, and all kinds of fun things in here covered in glitter. And also maybe just to have people look back there to Millie Wilson's Wig/Cunt, which is the earliest work in the exhibition from 1990 that's also really putting the sexological on display. In this case, the figure of the lesbian, who has often kind of been discounted by the sexological, kind of considered not deviant enough to be studied or counted or considered. And so this piece, which is a kind of a labial opening kind of wig, that's put in a very austere presentation, is another kind of space where we were thinking about the politics of looking and collection and display.
Yeah, and there's again, this is a happy accident of having this kind of phallic and labial sort of play in this sort of face-off. These works, we have this kind of line of the sexological typologies, the organization, categorization, even grid-like organization of sex objects. These are positioned between Wangechi Mutu's Histology of Uterine Tumors, and we have in the corner Candace Lynn's Night Moon. Both of these works have a direct relationship to medical illustration. Wangechi Mutu's collages are layered over pages from a book detailing diseases of the sexual organs. And so these collages have been built onto illustrations of uterine tumors. And the collages are composed of images taken from like National Geographic, porn, fashion editorials and advertisements. And there's a kind of giving face and also a defacing, and a way in which these works also play with the line between the human, the not human, the human and the animal. And they've been really important, I would say, meditation devices in Black feminist theory. I just want to note the work of Zakiya Jackson, who's writing about this is really phenomenal and very influential to our thinking. And in this corner, we have actually an activation of Night Moon. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Please, that's what the work wants. In the late 18th century, William Hunter published a study of the pregnant belly in every stage of pregnancy. And it's a landmark work in medical illustration. It's heralded for its realism and its accuracy. And in 2010, a medical historian hypothesized that you could never source enough cadavers to do this kind of anatomical study on pregnant bellies at every stage of pregnancy without working with people who were sourcing bodies by stalking and murdering pregnant people. And this is because when people are pregnant and get ill, the body tends to miscarry. So what's called an undelivered death is statistically very rare. Now, this has been this object of argument and controversy in the field. It's not a settled question by any means. There are people who, I'm going to put this in quotation marks, defend Hunter by observing that it's not like his illustrations were ever actually realistic. They were theatrically produced by desanguinating the body, pumping it full of like colored wax. That they had to stage these bodies for this kind of a study. So it's a site of really interesting inquiry in feminist visual studies. Candace Lynn sort of dives into this very sort of dark and difficult space. These images are noteworthy in medical illustration for the violence, as you can see, with which Hunter treated the pregnant body. And so the legs are cut off at the thigh. On the page, they're represented as if they were steaks, like it is really gruesome. And then the bodies are all also cut off at the waist. It was more traditional to actually cover bodies with draping in order to preserve their dignity. And so no such privilege was accorded to these bodies. And for that reason, William Hunter's work has been cited as playing an important role in the dehumanization of pregnant people, right? In the rendering of a mother's body into more or less a hothouse for growing a fetus. And so it's been understood to be a crucial part of establishing a visual language for anti-abortion culture. And so Candice Lynn has situated inside this an animated work called Inside Out, which is a montage and which is wickedly funny and very weird. And it's very typical of the artist's work. Jeanne?
And then we won't get a chance to talk about everything, but as we're moving through the other side of the exhibition, Candice has also produced a vapor, which is made of natural herbs that she produced a tincture for, and taken together, those are considered an abortifacient. And so those are kind of wafting a nice earthy smell through the air.
Yeah, and we're going to use this work, Candice Lynn's work, as a way for us to actually move to another very big area of inquiry in this show, which is the history of gynecology. So we're going to walk across the room.
The history of gynecology, which some of you may know, was really heralded as being founded by J. Marion Sims. He invented something called the speculum, which is still used today. And for those of you who know about this history, he produced this speculum through a series of non-consensual surgical experiments that he performed on enslaved Black women, disabled women, poor women, at a kind of a backyard hospital, and always without anesthesia.
Yes, or I should say, let me footnote that. It was always without anesthesia, only when the girls and women he was working on were Black. Right, so, and this show, a lot of the research in this show began with artists like King Cobra, who are working really directly with this history. I want to turn your attention to the banners. These are banners by Colleen Smith. And on one side, often there are images, and then on the other, names. And all of these names are names that come from the archives of scientific racism and the history of medicine. Anarcha, in particular, was subjected to more than 30 surgeries by J. Marion Sims. These surgeries were they were conducted with the aim of developing an effective surgical treatment for vesicovaginal fistula, which is a tear that can happen during a difficult childbirth or in violent sexual assault. And so these women were being experimented on in order to perfect their treatment, in order that they might be returned to forced servitude, to rape, to providing this kind of this really intense, hyper-exploitative reproductive labor of providing more people to be enslaved. So it's really one of the most difficult spaces in the show is that history. I invite people to come closer. As is true of Candice Lynn's work, this work wants you to see and to be aware of your seeing, and to place yourself really in relationship to this history. This is called vesicovaginal fistula, and this sculpture, this kind of like wounded flesh, feels very kind of anal and genital and vaginal all at once, cut open and sewn back together, is in a mirrored box. And through that mirrored box, you can actually see the almost the whole show, everything that's not behind these walls. And that's important to us to imagine that there's actually this kind of like an alternate universe that you access actually through this Black feminist lens. And then there's another, a story that this is intentionally connected to via Andrea Carlson's Unearthed Cannibal. So this is part of a series of works that take up the figure of the cannibal and discourse about cannibalism, which is a major part of early colonial literature especially. Many of you will be familiar of like the invocation of the figure of the cannibal at the limit of civilization. There is an indigenous perspective on cannibalism. And so there's a book by Jack D. Forbes that was published in the early 1970s called Columbus and Other Cannibals. And in this book, he offers indigenous thinking about insatiable greed the impulse to use just for the sake of using, use of resources with no mindfulness about their replenishment. There was a word used for this kind of illness, wetiko is an Algonquin word. Jack D. Forbes takes that concept and uses it in order to diagnose colonialism, capitalism, racism, sexism as forms of cannibal psychosis. And so there's a lot to, one can dive into so many different areas of this work. But this kind of confrontation between the colonial knowledge paradigm and indigenous knowledge systems, this is something that tends to define Andrea Carlson's work. I just also want to point to the text at the middle, which says, add sensitive content statement here, and here's in brackets, when community members are in the audience. And so this is in essence the trigger warning within the show. This really instructions to an administrator working at an institution like a museum to add a content warning when your, in essence, exhibition of this material may inflict harm on the communities that are represented by that display. We want you to think too about who is the cannibal in this story. This work here is called Fuck Baloney. Jeanne?
Yeah, so this is another work by King Cobra, who made vesicovaginal fistula. And part of Cobra's practice has actually been performance and tattooing and thinking about the flesh and engaging with the flesh. And so they actually made a silicone bust of J. Marion Sims's head after the statue of Sims in Central Park was taken down in the kind of Topple Monuments movement of 2020. And they also then bought a meat slicer and sliced that head. And that is those slices along with these little pins and staples and then dirt actually from J. Marion Sims's grave, which is a Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, are all mixed together to create this work. It's also part of a series that Cobra started working on, part of which was exhibited in New York at JTT Gallery, called White Meat, where they were interested in getting away from making work that in some way represented or alluded to Black flesh and thinking about the idea of putting something that alluded to Black flesh onto the market to be sold. And so they wanted to think instead about whiteness as the thing and that's why Jennifer brought up this idea of who is the cannibal. And so this work has been really important for us to think about seeing yourself in vesicovaginal fistula, seeing Carlson's work in that trigger warning and the story of revenge. So not to bring J. Marion Sims or Freud or any of these figures in except to kind of spit on their grave, so to speak. and then while we're here, I'll ask people to kind of shift a little bit because one of the other works thinking about trigger warnings and consent is the 16mm film by Patrick Staff that only turns on if you ask for it, but we're gonna do it for you. P Staff will be here to be in conversation tomorrow with Panteha. And this is kind of one of P's kind of signature works that's electric and thinking about light and pulsation and electricity. It's instructions for self-oriectomy, thinking again about survival care, pleasure, need, of gender-affirming healthcare outside systems of pathology, Western medical kind of diagnosis. And so the question of consent and having to turn it on and maybe making oneself vulnerable to the person who you have to ask to turn it on is also part of the exhibition, and who is it that is being called or hailed, or what our positions are. So,
and it's part of a sort of storyline that's kind of threaded throughout the show. It's like intentional, but one around which we felt responsibility to be careful, while also like non-defensive, especially to its sort of more humorous angles, which is castration anxiety. Castration anxiety as it gets manifested in the misogyny with which female bodies are treated, castration anxiety as it organizes anti-trans discourse, castration anxiety too in relationship to knowledge and power, right? And what happens when you actually take the subject who is privileged and entitled with that claim to be the subject who holds all the knowledge, and what happens when you actually challenge that. Yep.
Should we go in this way?
Sure.
We'll do something we never do, which is lead in a different direction.
Yeah. We're kind of being sodomitical in our relationship to the show right now by going in reverse and up through the back side of it. So this is work by Geo Wyax, and it's part of a cycle of performances that are held by the performance persona Muck Study Department. That's the name of the person in these performances. Muck Study Department conducts his research in like brackish water and ditches at the edges of a river, in a bathtub. We think of Muck Study Department as our resident scientist, doing his work somewhere else, and we're just hearing him working.
So Geo has been really interested in the question of Black trans study outside of the space of the medical and the kind of capital P philosopher. And so this work actually operates through like a radio transmission that's bouncing around, and we can kind of tune into it as we like. It's kind of an Inspector Gadget sort of figure that's asking people to dispense with the idea of science as clean and rational. And some of you may have seen Geo's performance at Joan recently, that kind of like a kooky guy with like a plastic bag full of coins. That was his version of the scientist.
Yes, yes.
And
and I just want to note too that this is placed. There are a few reasons for why it's placed here. Part of that's about sound, but also it seemed to live really well with Carlos Mota's homoerotic historiography, which is also a kind of a queer take on the presentation of knowledge, and particularly the anthropological. And those are all miniaturized figurines of there's sculptures or objects that are found across the Americas, pre-Columbian figures depicting sexual connection, erotic connection between male bodies, and some just sexy male bodies. And these have been left out of official discourse about cultural anthropology of the Americas. If you take a pre-Columbian culture class in an art history and art anthropology department, traditionally, you would not encounter these kinds of objects, because so many forms of queer knowledges and histories, knowledge that's anchored in the sexual, and especially in sexual pleasure, kind of fall out of the scientific discourse about what it means to know the thing. Right?
okay, so we'll ask everyone to come even more inside. You're going to see work here by Panteha Abareshi, who will also be on a panel tomorrow with P staff. These are works that, again, thinking about the relationship between care and constraint and the vulnerability of a disabled body and the question of the erotics of that care. Let's
do Louise.
Okay,
yeah,
Louise, okay.
Sorry, just because we're playing with the order of how we normally do this. We're negotiating. There's a relationship between Panteha Abareshi's work, which is emerging from the space of an intensely medicalized life, and Louise Bourgeois' Arch of Hysteria, which is a large cycle of works by the artist that respond to photographs of patients at a psychiatric hospital in Paris, and there's a book called The Studies in Hysteria, and these were produced by Jean-Martin Charcot, a neurologist, and these were all patients in his clinic, and they are photographs of women patients on their beds in the middle of what look like seizures. And at the time, the diagnosis hysteria might include people who would be diagnosed today with different forms of seizure disorder. Okay. Yeah. So,
and so for some of you are behind here. Some people are
Yes.
sitting on the couch, maybe. So this is a work by Nav Bustamante, who's a Los Angeles-based video and performance artist. This is part of a larger cycle of Now's work, thinking about the vaginasium. It's called vaginasium.
Yes.
And thinking about the space of the vaginal imaginary. Also some works about the speculum and thinking about J. Marion Sims. But in this work, Now is actually guiding the viewer through a series of pelvic floor exercises. And here she is inside of the vaginal imaginary, which we now have come to know is a cave-like labyrinth, if we didn't know already. And so there's actually sound coming out of the pillow, which is now instructing us. Everyone has a pelvis. That's an idea that is a somewhat radical one. It's been so over-gendered, so over-determined as having a single gender. And we also wanted to think about the couch in terms of the history of psychoanalysis as itself having taking up the space of an object in the exhibition that we could put on display, and Now has done it up by putting lights underneath and raising it on one side, kind of as a nod to lowrider culture. So please,
this is part of a larger cycle of work called Bloom, which originates in thinking about the possibilities of another kind of speculum and another kind of pelvic exam that might be more comfortable and it can
and pleasurable.
And so like the pelvic exam itself has for generations been structured by the idea that looking inside inside the body was going to reveal all this like information and knowledge. And it may come as a surprise to some folks that recently guidelines on pelvic exams have changed, such that, I mean, it was, for many of us here, it would have been part of our routine annual care. So you'd be going in for your pap smear and your annual, which would mean a pelvic exam. Now, today, pelvic exams are only recommended when patients are symptomatic, because it is not true that just looking inside the body is actually going to reveal useful information about how the patient is doing. You might start by asking the patient how they are doing. The misogyny of this line of thinking is so intense that it's only recently that the AMA issued new guidelines about pedagogy with medical students. Medical students used to be trained on surgery patients who were unconscious and had not consented to anything like a pelvic exam. And it was and I'm talking, it's just like a couple years ago, I heard somebody exclaim, JFC. It was only recently that this changed, and that was on the back of generations of medical students complaining because they felt implicated in a crime every time they were made to learn this way. Yeah. So
this also brings us to Candice Lynn's work on the Hunter engravings. So this kind of desire to look inside of the body as though it will produce some truth. There's a weird sound. Let's just all turn around exactly and take a look at Jess Fahn's Form Begets Function. This is a work that also puts on display certain
10 minutes. Sorry.
I'm losing my words. Certain things inside of the body,
the biological matter,
matter that seems so
Yeah.
gendered and raced as to only belong to certain kinds of bodies. So here we have suspended in glass urine, melanin, and depotestosterone. So urine is used to produce estrogen. So we have these kind of gendered and raced biochemicals. In fact, melanin is present in every single form of life, plant life, human life that relies or relates with the sun. And so by just suspending these I can't even think of the words.
It's
really.
okay.
It's so weird.
So behind us is a separate work called Xenophoria that's actually showing you the extraction of melanin from the surface of mushrooms and from squid. One of the things that this got me thinking about was how it's like you're looking at what feel like pretty much like molecules in inert material. But these materials, this idea of like that we have ideas about things like melanin, testosterone, and estrogen. Those ideas actually are very much in the way of knowing and understanding this material. There's a kind of an example from people who were trying to get pregnant and comparing notes. And some folks found that their testosterone levels were actually helping them with ovulation. And when they talked about this with their doctors, the doctors were like, testosterone's not good for women. Can't be good for pregnancy, right? And it turns out that actually testosterone plays an important role in ovulation, right? We all have testosterone and estrogen in our bodies because we need these hormones to live. They're important to things like bone health, heart health, things that we don't necessarily think of as related to sex and gender, but are very, there's an ideology of sexual difference and ideologies of racial difference that cling to these molecules, or that we rather pour over these molecules. You can't blame this material, right, for that. My students really love the title, Form Begets Function. Some folks who work in architecture and design will know that phrase really well, but they were honing in on that word beget, right, and thinking about the term beget as a really interesting kind of generation and reproduction. And so they went to this kind of really high formal reading of this work, which I really appreciate.
Yeah. So I think maybe we have two more works that we'll talk about.
Yeah.
The first this is another work by Sandra Ibarra, who made Chest Rest in the front room. This is called, there's a video that's called She's on the Rag. And then here we have 12 representing the 12 months
This is She's on the Rag, and that's menstrual.
This is menstrual Rorschach.
Wait.
It's all she's on the. I'm really tired.
Yeah.
Anyway,
let's start that again. This is She's on the Rag, which is part of a long series of works that are produced monthly. So there are prints.
There's 12 because for the 12 potential cycles of menstruation. It's actually the only blood in the entire exhibition, interestingly enough.
That we know of.
Yeah. Someone might have snuck some in there. So we have like dirt from a grave, we have urine, melanin, testosterone, blood, pierced leather, and herbs that can give you an abortion. So Sandra actually made these kind of, which are, real nods like feminist art history and, women's art, quote unquote, and she sold them on Etsy and asked people to kind of engage with her in a relational interpretation. And so when she sold them, she asked them to connect back with her about what they saw.
So if you would like give her your interpretation of this image as you would in a Rorschach kind of therapeutic conversation, and then she sent those that person, she would send them an audio file of her reading, and this is what is on the monitor over here. It's a single reading of one person in response to one person's interpretation, right, of her print.
So this is a work that's like feels so timely that it makes you kind of suffocate. These are books that, so the Magnus Hirschfeld Institute, which was burned in 1933 as part of a kind of Nazi effort, and the Magnus Hirschfeld Institute was kind of a place of study, but also a home, a domicile where queer and trans people were, studying, living together, also receiving care, early kind of gender-affirming care. When the institute was burned, some of the books kind of found their way over the decades to flea markets or into people's homes, and they may have had like a little notation to know that that's where they originated from. And so Jeanne has actually been working with the institute and going back and through a kind of 3D photo geometric process has been making in glass exact replicas of the books. There's just a couple, when you come up close, you can see kind of the etchings and the title, but mostly they're just, they're either see-through or they're cloudy or they have bubbles, which are meant to indicate a kind of like water log of having, wherever they've traveled from the time of, the life of these books. And so in this time where there is so much kind of active repression, this work is very timely, but also just when you go into the bathroom, you'll see Chris Vargas's Museum of Transgender History and Art, a wallpaper that Chris made, which is kind of a bookshelf of queer and trans titles, thinking about how does one even make a trans canon. And in that space, the toilet, which is kind of a joke on reading, becomes a kind of cruising space for knowledge. And so we have these different spaces where books become very important.
Yeah, books are general, like they recur throughout the exhibition, and something about the way you were talking about these was making me think too about how queer books are ways in which people recognize each other. That you say like you hand a friend a copy of Little Women or Moby Dick, or that there's
The Well of Loneliness.
The Well of Loneliness. But seriously, these are so important, and these are like really what it means to construct a queer archive in a library. It's a way of holding history and knowledge, but it's also a site through which people find each other.
That's probably a great place to almost end. We're going to take you to see Schreber Was a Woman.
Going down the rabbit hole fully with you. I think we talked for like 2.5 hours. And I just want to say this project is called Schreber Is a Woman. And as somebody who trained in queer theory, I encountered the figure of Daniel Schreber, who wrote a memoir called Memoirs, or wrote a document that's published as their memoirs, a patient memoir, Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, which is a major text in like psychoanalytic literature, and in particular, like really homophobic and transphobic writing. And that said, I had never seen Daniel Schreber. I had never truly encountered Daniel Schreber until I saw this work, and so I'm going to hand this to you. Yeah.
So thank you. Well, this work started reading about Schreber and reading different interpretations about these memoirs written originally by Schreber, and after that. Amma and I was thinking about, well, let's read the memoirs, let's feel these memoirs, and after that we started thinking about this work, which is like what will happen if we rethink the historiography of modern psychology, considering Schreber as a trans woman. Because all modern psychology consider Schreber problems as closeted gay men or other aspects about, Freud founded Oedipus syndrome about Schreber. So there is a lot of modern problematics around Schroeder's case. And one of our hypotheses and one of our possibilities to rethink or replace all this trauma and all these possibilities around transness, queerness, and heritage is rethinking Schroeder as a trans woman. And that's also a really possibility that you can feel reading the memoirs of Schroeder.
And, the title of the work is really important. It's a very simple declaration. Schroeder is a woman. And as a exhibition, as the time span of the exhibition has rolled on, I think we've felt that power accumulate in that statement. This is the one place in the show where you have orgasm. I think that's also a really important story about this work. There's a kind of a chapter in here. I've forgotten the name that would have this song. There's a chapter in here where the Schroeder is on a bed in the most beautiful lace nightie, which I'm sort of obsessed with. And she is pleasuring herself, and she's running her hands all over her body. And it is an extended rolling orgasm, and it's really beautiful. And when I first encountered it, it was the thing. That's what we're listening to. Incite yourself sexually. This is where you should incite yourself sexually. Incite yourself sexually. That's repeated over and over again. And that's what the lesson we want to take you to all take away.
That seems like a great place to pause. Thank you all for coming. We're going to be here. There's going to be a reception.
And a talk.
And a talk at 7 p.m. with Hill Malatino. Thank you so much. Come and say hi. Thanks all.